prevent leakage that's coming in other times of the year, coming out of the ocean. To really try to help drive this curve in a flat phase and then hopefully ultimately draw it down. So what are the mechanisms that are naturally consuming CO2 out of the atmosphere? There's three general areas here. We can do it it's being done biologically, physically, and chemically or geochemically. Biology consumes CO2, water, nutrients, and life, plants and phytoplankton to make biomass. And as long as that carbon stays as biomass or is sequestered or stored, we have a mechanism of capturing and storing, removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it. Physically, the ocean is passively absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere because the partial pressure of atmospheric CO2 is higher than the partial pressure in the ocean. The concentration in the atmosphere is higher than the ocean, and therefore CO2 naturally wants to diffuse into the ocean. So we can think about maybe trying to also accelerate this, but there's some negative parts of that I'll get into. The third way to do this is through chemical or geochemical means. CO2 reacts with water to form carbonic acid. It also reacts with carbonate ion in seawater to form bicarbonate. This is important because most of the CO2 that enters in this way, very little of it stays as molecular CO2. It is consumed either by forming this acid or by reacting making carbonate ion, bicarbonate ion. There are also ways to consume CO2 that involve minerals, magnesium and calcium silicates, calcium carbonate, etc. These react to make mineral carbonates or bicarbonates either in solid or dissolved form. So this is another mechanism whereby we can capture and store CO2. So I'm just going to march through each of these categories and give you a flavor of what we can do or what's being thought about in the marine environment in this context. So marine biology, first and foremost, this is one that was very early on talked about and actually experiments conducted on, was ocean fertilization. Primarily adding iron, or you can also add other nutrients. There are large areas of the ocean that whose photosynthesis is nutrient limited, and if you add that limited nutrient, phytoplankton will grow and we will drive the reaction this way to create more biomass. So the positives here is theoretically this is high capacity, and it also there's a potential additional benefit here is that you are growing the base of the food web. You're providing a food source. And this could be advantageous for fisheries, for example, in providing either fish food sources. It's also potentially cheap, although that is now come into question because it turns out that this is not as efficient in capturing and storing carbon as originally thought. It tends to be rather leaky. First of all, the carbon doesn't necessarily stay as biomass, but can easily be expired and go back this way to regenerate CO2. And so it's turned out to be less efficient than originally thought. The other concern here is that by adding nutrients, you're going to select for certain kinds of phytoplankton that may not naturally be dominant in that ecosystem. And so you have the potential of really altering the ocean ecosystem in ways that we don't fully understand. Another strategy is called blue carbon. This idea is to either restore or expand coastal ecosystems like marshes, kelp forests, seagrasses, things like that. The positive here is that, in fact, you are helping out these ecosystems by restoring and conserving them. The issue is that it turns out there's relatively little global capacity here to increase the storage, so that it's rather limited in terms relative to the task we have at hand of consuming CO2. The other concern is that these ecosystems tend to emit other greenhouse gases like methane and oxides of nitrogen, so that's another concern here. Third idea is to expand aquaculture or permaculture. We can do this for carbon storage, or we can use it for food, fuel, and fiber and help substitute for these that are otherwise being produced on land. This gives us more control on the biological processes and will reduce land impacts, especially in producing food, fuel, and fiber. But obviously it's going to be more energy intensive and management intensive. The capacity, a little uncertain here depending on how much energy and management we want to invest here. And there could be downstream ocean impacts of this that would need to be considered. Physically stuffing more CO2 into the ocean. Well, it's been thought about, people have thought about directly injecting CO2 into the deep ocean and keeping it away from the atmosphere. The problem there is that that water ultimately, on timescales of 1,000 years, comes back to the surface and will be gas, so it's not really a super long-term solution. The other concern is that if you add molecular CO2 to the ocean, you're going to acidify it. That's a bad thing for ocean ecosystems. The possible way around that is you could think of packaging the CO2 in ways that doesn't react with the water, or inject it under the seafloors, for example, analogous to a CCS process. And the third method, chemical or geochemical methods. The basic chemistry here is that if you have an acid and you neutralize that with a base, you generate a neutral, pH-neutral solution of a mineral salt. In the case of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, we have an acid that we react the CO2 with water, and we want to neutralize that with a base. And when we do that, we generate mineral bicarbonates and carbonates either in solution or in solid form. So what do we use for a base? Well, one option is to use mineral bases. These are very abundant on the Earth's crust, and in fact, these kinds of reactions are the way that the Earth predominantly absorbs excess atmospheric CO2 in geologic timescales. So we have a very high potential here. The problem is that most of these reactions are very slow. And so to speed them up, you have to invest energy, heat, temperature, what have you, to sort of speed these up. And that can be costly and can be an issue. These also tend not to be pure. There may be contaminants in there. And we're putting these mineral bicarbonates bases into the ocean. We have to be careful that we're not adding things that will negatively impact the ocean ecosystem. The other source of base would be, of course, synthetic bases. There are plenty of commercially available sources here. Very high reaction rates. We don't have to worry about that. The negative here is it's going to cost you. These are not cheap. They do require energy input, and there could be a carbon input involved here. There also may be impurities, so that is another potential negative. There are also hybrid methods, and Katharine touched on this. I really think there's a lot of potential here looking at putting various parts of these together in a synergistic way. We can talk about biological, physical, or chemical, or we can talk about hybrid ocean and land methods. There's a variety of ways that you can merge some of these technologies and come up with something that's very high capacity, potentially low cost, and low impacts. But these are areas that need to be further explored. Now, in terms of thinking about the marine environment to reduce our emissions, obviously we would like to ultimately stop using fossil energy and start using renewable sources. And the ocean has a lot of renewable energy in it. It's, by my calculation, at least twice what the land has to offer. That's because 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean. Most of the solar, most of the wind, etc. is out there. So there's plenty of energy here. This is in comparison to our current demand for energy. The negative here, if we're going to use the ocean as an energy source, is it tends to be very long ways from the markets of where we want to use this energy. So it's going to be expensive, and there could be some environmental trade-offs, but there's plenty of resource out there if we choose to use it. Now, in terms of governance issues, many of the things I just talked about are really concepts that are really clearly worked on them, and it's been essentially zero done at the kinds of scales we really need to do. So there's a lot of unknowns, and because of that, there needs to be some oversight into the research, and especially if we get to the stage of actually doing these at large scales, to try to avoid some negative impacts that are really undesirable. The governance here of marine CDR and carbon management is really in its infancy. The marine protocol managed by the International Marine Organization was formed back in, I think, that was signed, I think, in the early 2000s, dealing with, it was an international agreement on ocean dumping. And they have subsequently gotten very interested in geoengineering or carbon dioxide removal methods in that, in the case where this involves ocean dumping or impacting the ocean in international waters. And their first test case really was ocean iron fertilization. And now they want to expand this to come up with a more general, generic treatment of anything that's going to go out there and dump things in the ocean. Further research is clearly needed on all of these approaches, and there's going to have to be an interplay between governance and research here to sort of allow us to get information that we can then feed back to governance. And so we can come up with a structure here that's not overly restrictive, but which also doesn't allow indiscriminate destruction of large parts of the ocean. And maybe the ultimate governance issue here is that if we come up with cost-effective, large-scale ways of removing atmospheric CO2, who's going to decide what level of atmospheric CO2 we want? It's a big question. Obviously, we're a long ways from being there, but that might be the ultimate governance issue, is who's going to set the global CO2 and climate thermostat here. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, please hold your questions, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Bill Burns to talk to us about Paris Agreement. Speaking of governance.
All right, thank you. So as we all know, the Paris Agreement, which entered into force in November of 2016, is the world community's primary international legal instrument to address climate change in the medium term and the long term, at least for most of the world other than maybe ourselves. And so the pertinent question, I think, to ask is, could these carbon dioxide removal approaches be part of the way that the world community responds to climate change under the Paris Agreement? And could it, as a second question, could it be an instrument that in some ways mediates the scope of the deployment of these carbon dioxide removal approaches and tries to ameliorate some of the potential negative impacts and addresses some of the governance issues that the previous speaker had spoken about? So I want to look very briefly at both of those questions. So the first question is, would the Paris Agreement authorize its parties to utilize these carbon dioxide removal approaches as one of their ways of meeting their commitments under the Paris Agreement? So very briefly again, as Katharine had indicated, this is the long-term objectives of the Paris Agreement that the parties have committed themselves to meet. So holding temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and at least aspirationally holding them to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, at the heart of the mitigation mandates of the Paris Agreement are the mitigation pledges that the parties make, and we see this under Article 4. Developed countries are to undertake what we call economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets, and developing countries are to continue to enhance their mitigation efforts. And in terms of meeting these commitments, these mitigation commitments are to be embodied in the pledges that the parties make under the so-called nationally determined contributions under Article 4.2. So as you can see here, it says each party is to communicate and maintain successfully nationally determined contributions and pursue in that commitment domestic mitigation measures. So the question is here, would carbon dioxide removal approaches constitute a quote-unquote domestic mitigation measure? Okay. Now, interestingly enough, the Paris Agreement doesn't define the term mitigation. Okay, but its parent agreement, the Framework Convention, does, and so that's where I would start this analysis. So if you look at the Framework Convention and its definition of mitigation, it indicates that mitigation can be effectuated in 2 ways. First of all, by parties limiting their anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, and second of all, by protecting and enhancing greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs. And the Secretariat's fact sheet also talks about these as the 2 means of effectuating mitigation. Okay? So if one looks at carbon dioxide removal approaches, okay, obviously they are not a means of limiting greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? So the question is, are they a way of protecting and enhancing greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs? Okay? So the next question is defining this term sinks. Okay? And again, this is a term that is not defined under the Paris Agreement, but is defined under the Framework Convention. So the Framework Convention defines sinks as any process, activity, or mechanism that removes a greenhouse gas, an aerosol, or a precursor of a greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. So if you look at that definition, it would appear that the carbon dioxide removal technologies that we've talked about would fall squarely under the ambit of the term sinks, right? Bioenergy and carbon capture, for example, would enhance our sinks by effectuating the removal of carbon dioxide through the planting of the bio stocks that we talked about, and then storage. Similarly, direct air capture would be a means of creating an additional sink for sequestering carbon dioxide, as well as a number of the ocean-based approaches that Greg had spoken about previously. Moreover, if you look at the Framework Convention and some of the examples that it talks about in terms of sinks and reservoirs, it talks about explicitly biomass as well as forests and oceans as means of creating and enhancing these sinks. If you look at the Paris Agreement itself, it also, in Article 5, explicitly encourages the parties to conserve and enhance sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. Moreover, as Katharine had suggested, Article 4.1 talks explicitly about the parties by the second half of the century trying to balance their emissions and their sinks. So in all cases, there's an encouragement under Paris to do this, as well as, at least in the Framework Convention, a definition of mitigation that would appear to contemplate utilizing these technologies. And so I think an argument could be made that the parties could at least partially meet their commitments under Paris in their MDCs by claiming that they're reducing emissions by deploying these carbon dioxide removal approaches. Of course, there ought to be all kinds of questions associated with permanence, monitoring, and the nature of those removals. But at least in theory, it appears that they could do that. Moreover, there appear to be other provisions in Paris that would be pertinent to this. If you look at Article 6 of Paris, it contemplates so-called market-based mechanisms where parties could enter into cooperative agreements with other parties to reduce emissions and pay for those commitments. So it might be in the longer term, for example, in the context of bioenergy and carbon capture projects, for example, a developed country might help develop bioenergy and carbon capture facilities in a developing country, for example, and then claim credit for the enhancement of the sink that would occur. Similarly with other technologies such as direct air capture, for example, or some of the other technologies that we talked about under this agreement. And then finally, under Article 10, the provision for the provision of technology to other countries could also be pertinent. It's possible that in the longer term, again, developed countries might help developing countries develop these technologies in cases where it might be advantageous for those technologies to be sited in those areas. For example, as Katharine had suggested, there may be a salutary convergence between where bioenergy feedstocks are found and where the most propitious areas are for storing that carbon. And in those cases, it might be that we want to transfer those technologies, and Paris contemplates that we would do that. Now, the second question is, does the Paris Agreement also have provisions that might regulate the scope of how much we can deploy these technologies, as well as to try to address some of the potential negative impacts that both Katharine and Greg have already talked about? And I would suggest that Paris does. If you look under the preamble of Paris, Paris doesn't, interestingly enough, indicate that you have to look at the negative impacts of climate change, but also you have to look at the impacts of measures that are taken to respond to climate change. And that's provided for in the preamble as well as in Article 4. And then more specifically, Paris suggests some specific potential impacts of response measures that the parties are to take into account and presumably seek to ameliorate. If you look in the preamble, for example, it says that when taking actions to address climate change, the parties are to respect, promote, and consider obligations in terms of human rights. Moreover, the Paris Agreement suggests in its preamble that your response measures have to be taken in a way that protects the integrity of all ecosystems. And I would suggest that many of the potential technologies that might be deployed under the context of carbon dioxide removal approaches might be mediated by these provisions. For example, take bioenergy and carbon capture. As Katharine suggested, bioenergy and carbon capture might require diverting large amounts of land. It's been estimated that large-scale deployment of this technology, for example, at 10 to 15 gigatons annually of removal, might require somewhere between 7 and 25% of the net primary productivity of the world. It might require as much land as India, or perhaps 2 Indias. Okay? It might require large diversions of agricultural land, which might be the most propitious land to use, from agricultural crop production to energy crop production. And in doing so, it could substantially raise food prices. One recent study indicated that large-scale deployment of BECCS, for example, could raise food prices by as much as 30 to 40% for some of the world's most vulnerable people. If this were to happen, the potential impact on human rights, as indicated under the Paris Agreement, could become relevant. For example, if you were to raise food prices by that much, you might potentially negatively impact or impinge upon the human right to food, recognized under several international legal instruments. As a consequence, Paris might seek to, and the parties to Paris might seek to limit the scale of that deployment, or might mandate that every effort be made not to divert land from agricultural production, but to utilize other sources such as crop residues or so-called third-generation sources of bioenergy such as algae. And to the extent that Paris provides for those protections, it might ensure that we deploy these technologies in a way that balance our need to address climate change as well as protect social justice and equity in this context. The same might be true in terms of water. Large-scale deployment of BECCS might require as much water as all the water that's currently used for irrigation on Earth. Okay? That obviously could have huge implications in terms of the internationally recognized human right to water. And as a consequence, again, the Paris Agreement might limit the extent of that deployment or encourage means to reduce the potential water footprint in a way that would not occur if we didn't have this protective footprint in place. And in that way, it's beneficial. Biodiversity also. To the extent that large-scale deployment of BECCS might, for example, require large-scale clearing of grasslands or forests for bioenergy feedstock, it could have very large biodiversity impacts. One recent study indicated it could have as much impact on biodiversity as increasing temperatures by 2.8 degrees Celsius. To the extent that the Paris Agreement indicates that you must ensure to protect the integrity of ecosystems in terms of your response measures, it could limit or regulate how BECCS is deployed in the future. One other quick example, ocean iron fertilization, which Greg had mentioned. Ocean iron fertilization, as he had mentioned, might result in production of phytoplankton species that are not palatable like zooplankton species in ecosystems, or ocean ecosystems around the world. And that could result in a biological trophic cascade, as species above them that rely on those zooplankton would also suffer. To the extent that the Paris Agreement, again, mandates the protection of ecosystems, it might regulate the scale or even the deployment of these kind of technologies, or at least could compel us to more accurately assess those. And in that way, it could be advantageous. Similarly, to the extent that it might rob downstream areas of nutrients by diverting those nutrients, it might have impacts in terms of food production, in terms of fish, and also impinge on the right to food, as well as the right to subsistence and livelihood under international human rights instruments, and those should all be considered. And then finally, I would suggest that Paris would have a mechanism to actually assess these potential impacts should we decide that we want to look at deployment of carbon dioxide removal approaches in the future. Okay? The Framework Convention in 2011 established a forum and work program to assess the impact of the implementation of response measures, okay, under the Framework Convention. That forum has now been adopted under the Paris Agreement. Among other things, it allows the parties to establish working groups for specific issues. And so experts could be brought in the context of any of the potential carbon dioxide removal approaches to try to assess their potential impacts and try to ameliorate those impacts in the future. And then finally, Paris also provides for the establishment of transparent processes to assess NDCs. This would help us to assess the permanence of any of these carbon dioxide removal approaches. As Greg suggested, there may be issues associated with permanence, and there certainly would be in the context of not only ocean-based approaches, but things such as BECCS, as well as direct air capture. And it also provides for ensuring that the NDCs are, quote, fair and ambitious. And to the extent that issues of social justice in terms of these technologies would potentially be pertinent, how the countries decided to develop their portfolio between mitigation measures that reduce emissions directly, as well as those that might seek to sequester more carbon, and what that fair balance would be something that the Paris Agreement and its parties could potentially look at in the future. And so I'd suggest that as we are most likely will continue to look at these measures in the future, and as they move from the largely theoretical to the potentially deployable, the Paris Agreement may provide some framework and some guidance for how they may be deployed in the future. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to invite our panelists to just bring your chairs up. We'll have a more relaxed sort of forum here.
Turn off.
And turn the lights on. There we go. we'll have a good half hour here, perhaps a little longer if our panelists indulge us to ask questions. And I thought I might just lead us off with a question that I'll address to all of you, which is, it's a lot of information. So where are we in some kind of learning curve in terms of research and development of all of these technologies? And I ask this because I sent out to my students an article you may have seen in the New York Times this Sunday on soil. You know, can soil save the earth? Right? You saw that article. But one of the things that struck me a lot in that article was that there was a story about farmers up in Marin County who started to understand that if they changed their, they were having cattle, they were running cattle, if they would change their methods of managing the soil, the soil could be a net carbon storage, they could increase their carbon storage. But what struck me was that they didn't know by how much. So they had these scientists come out and they were working with a team from UC Berkeley to actually measure and to see if this thing was going to work. And this is within the last year. So when, for example, Katharine would say, look, the potential for these bio approaches, the land-based approaches, may not be scalable, I wonder, do we know? Right? When you say the same for blue carbon, maybe it's not so great, but we may have some potential for marine effects. I'm not sure even what that is. What do we actually know? Where are we at in measuring the capacities here and understanding what they might be? And the same, is there a working group, you know, on what kind of metrics are we using in this? Where are we in this whole process?
Okay, I did a paper that was published, I guess, a month ago exactly on this soils question, because it is yet another place where the dialogue has gone from soils will save us, you know, just let the cows go out on pasture and miracles are going to happen. In terms of our expert elicitation, we basically did a very formalized documentation of expert judgments on all these soil numbers. The expert said you need to really be careful about the concept of soil saving us. So the New York Times article, I would say, was on the very optimistic side. Maybe I'll introduce two things.
It's Earth Week, it's Earth Day. Something new.
So there is huge potential to increase the amount of carbon stored in the soil. There are a few reasons that's really hard. A, soil carbon is actually very, very hard to measure in a precise sense. It's highly variable within any one location. It's easy to get carbon out of the soil. It's a very slow process to get carbon in. I think when we think about the fully biological approaches, that's a really key feature. Carbon is slow to come into a forest, in the soils. It can be a fast out. For example, when you have wildfires throughout the state of California, that's tons of carbon going up in flames. I often think about the biological ecosystem stewardship, BECS, middle of the road category, and direct air capture is 10, 100, 1,000 in terms of approximate cost for some of these in the current world. The stuff that's ecosystem stewardship is more doable, more feasible right now. We have good examples of it. At the same time that we need to be really smart about whether we know how much carbon is there, much easier for a forest than for soils. And through to direct air capture, the real question there is how fast can we drive down those costs. The one company that is up and going says they are down to something like $500 per ton, but we'll have better numbers.
So the question is, what do we know? Do we know enough?
Well, I'm assuming this is what we're in some early days in terms of understanding the science, the metrics, let alone the business model for how these things can be. So I'm just asking in the marine world.
Sure. Well, we know very little. We don't know enough, and we need to do more research to find out, first of all, what all our options are. Right? I put a list up there, but we're in early days here. We still don't know what all of our options might be. And as I said, I think these hybrid approaches, you know, like BECS is an example, biology and engineering. There are other examples of that could be explored, and we don't know what all of those are yet. So we're in very early days, and I think we're going to need a lot of research here to find out what the benefits are, costs, what the impacts, what the capacity is. I mean, we can kind of speculate on that, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and we're nowhere near to the point where we can really deploy these right now.
A couple of things. I mean, even soils and forests, our characterizations and assessments, I think, are at a really rudimentary level. So there are some studies that say that if you utilize no-till agriculture, right, which is kind of one of the poster childs for enhancing soil sequestration, you might increase microbial activity in ways that releases so much nitrous oxides that you offset or actually result in that increase in warming, right? Other studies say that's not true, right? But the point is that it's contested. Forests always sounds like, you know, again, mother and apple pie sort of thing, right? But there's also studies that say that if you plant forests in the northern hemisphere, especially on lands that have high albedo, high reflectivity, like scrublands, right? You get a benefit of sequestering more carbon dioxide by planting the forest, but since you've decreased the reflectivity in terms of solar radiation and more of it is absorbed, it might offset 75% or result in a net increase in warming, right? So again, where you plant the forest makes a huge difference, right? So, and I think we're still at early stages of doing that kind of assessment. And so that's problematic even for the things that are considered soft carbon dioxide removal. The harder ones, like the direct air capture, we essentially have a couple of very small scale demonstration plants, one in Switzerland right now that's up and running, and as Katharine suggested, they're still at somewhere between $400 to $500 per ton captured, right? That's not going to be competitive in a world where the social cost of carbon is you know, $7 or $9 in the European Union, for example. Right, and I don't know where we're going to get there. We have some demonstration plants for BECCS also, and some just for CCS, but again, early stages and not all propitious results. So we need a lot more, in my opinion, we need a lot more funding to try to separate the wheat from the chaff at this point, but we have very little, and we don't have a social cost of carbon that may drive these into the market, even if we're able to develop them successfully.
Well, thanks for that. All right, so let's see who's got questions. I'll just kind of get a sense of how many we got here. All right, terrific. We'll start with you and then Kyle.
Oh, so I had a question, kind of big picture on learning curve, but you know, it's tremendous that a number of countries could agree to keep working on this. But I'm wondering, this 2%, which, or 2 degree, which I think I left off with Al Gore in his movie. And I thought, well, we're going to be talking about that for a long time, because when I was in school, you know, we were changing our minds every year. We didn't have the setup yet for really measuring the way we do now. So we can measure temperature changes globally better. But how does that concurrence come, you know, to even get science, you know, to kind of put their stamp on the 2%? I mean, the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree. That's probably a question for you.
Okay, so I'm not really a carbon dioxide removal expert. It's funny that I've been doing a lot of work in this space. What I'm an expert on is actually the basis of your question. So what I've done really is what is the state of understanding on impacts that have already happened and future risks. And in the last IPCC cycle, I directed science for the working group that basically provided the scientific basis for the negotiation of that long-term temperature goal. And it involved multi-year structured expert dialogue, where those of us who are IPCC experts and developed the synthesis of this would talk with all the governments as they were wanting to answer the science questions to then make choices about that long-term temperature goal. So in some ways, I think what was really fascinating about watching that process unfold and where 2 degrees Celsius came from, and it was, you were in Paris, it was the middle weekend of Paris, where suddenly there was the first draft with 1.5 in there within brackets, and everyone's like, yep, it's going to be in there. And I will say that no one really saw that coming in a really profound sense. So in terms of where that came from a judgment of watching the science policy process happen, it seemed like the evidence that was most convincing for people recognizing that dangerous climate change, it does have questions of what scale, what scope, dangerous climate change essentially being ultimate objective of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, what we're trying to prevent. But it seemed like the thing that was most convincing scientifically was the fact that we have already seen climate change that for some people in some places is already dangerous. We have comprehensive evidence across every continent that impacts are already happening. And in terms of where science is, We're now in a world where event by event, we can calculate how much more likely that event was, whether it is a heat wave or there are 3 studies out for Harvey already, how much more likely was the intensity of that event or its likelihood to occur at all, given our emissions of heat-trapping gases. So I think this understanding that climate change is already happening has been one of the biggest motivators for 2 degrees Celsius. That said, the main framework for risk assessment was called Reasons for Concern. It's basically saying that when we think about what's at stake in a changing climate, there is no one way to measure that risk. Different people will put different values on the present versus the future, rich versus the poor. And those reasons for concern, why we should have this on the radar, is that the most affected systems that are going to be hit very much in the near term, you can put coral reefs, for example, in that category with the Great Barrier Reef over the last few years, all the way through to the potential for game changers. So the loss of the western Antarctic ice sheet basically has really important uncertainties about the stability given the current emissions and how fast they're happening. That type of collapse would be irreversible on our human timescales. So those types of reasons for concern are very different ways of thinking about risk across those different choices that are ethical, not scientific. But they all bring us to this point with 4 degrees Celsius warming in this century, its severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts, no matter really how you define the category of risk.
So is there an ongoing effort to be looking at that? So the next time, the world gets together, we can have a little faster, well, I guess we already have a draft because we had one Paris Agreement, but have a little faster dialogue on this. I mean, I know the scientific community will continue studying, so we'll be reading papers all along, but the opportunity to put it together and start getting the social aspects, and probably at some point the actual engineering will be coming in as well. So I imagine all sorts of working groups will be established.
If you look at the pathways that are put forward, achieving a 2-degree target is a very ambitious pathway in terms of mitigation. So, like you, when I saw the 1.5, I was pretty, whoa, it was amazing. Kyle, you had a question.
Yes, I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about how you spoke about the water requirement being equal to agriculture. How can we combine carbon capture sequestration with renewable energy to provide a better method to obtain water by changing our system of energy? So we can maybe get water from the ocean like through desalination, that's not the best option, but to change the dependency on natural water sources to address issues that are beyond water security.
I mean, I can give you a few random thoughts. Do you want to go first? I think something that we all highlighted to some degree is that there are real trade-offs to consider in the space of negative emissions. And if we say this will be a huge player in our portfolio of climate responses, we really do have severe land, water, energy trade-offs that we need to think about. I think certainly moving into the future, our water cycle is changing due to climate change indeed. It's kind of an intensified water cycle, you can think of it that way, where we've got reduced snowpack, increased evaporation, a world where we might see more heavy downpours and more drought simultaneously, given that intensification. We also have the human management of our water systems, and here in California, there obviously have been long-running droughts. At least the water experts that I hear on the Stanford campus most often say it's not as if we want to throw out our system of water management, but we certainly want to be tuning it up moving forward. Through the drought, there are parts of the state that just substantially subsided given groundwater overdraw and that sort of thing. So I think there are real ways where we could combine energy and water more strongly. I think desal is a perfect example of that, especially given the intensified water cycle and the fact that water security at the global scale is one of the key risks we need to be thinking about. But it's a pretty good example of how interconnected all of these systems are in a changing climate when we think about impacts reverberating, but also responses.
If I could just elaborate, something I didn't do in my talk, I mentioned marine BECCS. BECCS has a huge, conventional BECCS has a huge freshwater impact. You can avoid a lot of that by growing saltwater plants to fuel that system. That's one thing. Now, CCS itself is also water intensive, so that's something to consider. And in terms of desal, I mean, it's really an energy issue. It's right now, it's very energy and costly to do. But as I said, we have plenty of energy. There's plenty of energy out there in the ocean to power desalination. It's not going to be cheap, and it's not going to be necessarily convenient, to harvest that energy. But there are ways of generating fresh water from salt water, again, if you have enough energy. Plus, there's additional ideas that are being explored. I've read about, for example, graphene filters that are so effective they're able to actually filter out the salt from the from seawater. Now, that probably requires a lot of pressure, which means it's also energy intensive, but it could be that it's less energy intensive than conventional methods. So I think there are some ways that the ocean can help us sidestep the water issue and maybe even try to help solve the fresh supply of fresh water.
Yeah. Last quick thing I'd add is Marine Becks, again, if you were cultivating algae, for example, for bioenergy production, the algae can help filter the water and decrease contamination in some cases. You have to do it carefully or it can increase contamination also, but if done well, it can serve as a natural filtration system that would help increase water quality and thus access in some areas.
Could you just elaborate a little bit? I'm trying to get a vision here. So you're growing algae, presumably in some coastal area, and then you harvest it and what? You process it, you burn it, and create an oil, same thing, and then sequester it either in the ocean or on land, or so there's some moving around of okay.
It's biomass. Biomass contains energy in it. If you combust it, you release energy that can be used to generate electricity. So in terms of growing algae, yes, you can actually do it on land. There's algae cultures that they put in tanks, highly controlled. Another advantage of algae is it's highly productive per square meter. It's much more productive than, say, a forest or even a managed forest. So in terms of aerial land use, it can be much more efficient. And of course, you can avoid using land altogether. You can grow these out in the ocean, where people are talking about permaculture and aquaculture actually cut in the ocean where there's no land footprint. So that's another potential advantage.
What is permaculture?
Well, I'm not an expert there, but there are those who are advocating, for example, growing kelp, having large, in effect, kelp farms, even out in the middle of the ocean. And the purpose of these would simply be to have an ecosystem out there, a carbon-dense ecosystem that would absorb and store carbon. And it also would potentially help the surrounding open ocean ecosystem, provide food, shelter, whatever. But there are those that are advocating that you go out in the open ocean and that you grow these things, for example, kelp in large ways in order to consume and store carbon.
Just sit there.
They're just there. Yeah.
Plastic giant.
But I really wanted to ask, though, deals with carbon capture and sequestration other than bioenergy, CCS. You didn't talk much about power plants, for example, burning natural gas and coal, implementing CCS. And I assume the reason is it is beastly expensive. And I can't imagine how, in the next decade or so, we're going to be able to afford CCS, absent a carbon tax to pay for it.
So the reason why we didn't talk about it much today is that it's not net negative, so to speak. So it's definitely a way to reduce the carbon intensity of electricity generation from coal or natural gas, but it doesn't make it fully negative. That said, I think when we think about the role of CCS, there's been increasing attention to one of the challenges in a kind of endgame energy system where we're close to net negative is that we may be reliant on a lot of intermittent generation from renewables, where sun isn't always shining, wind isn't always blowing. There are different ways to deal with that, but in the current world, it's oftentimes gas peakers that are the best way to deal with if you've got what's called a duck curve here in California, where basically there are times of day where we suddenly have a lot of load that's hard to meet in terms of electricity generation. Gas is fast ramp up. If it had CCS, it could be faster ramp up and a lot closer to carbon neutral.
I guess the other thing I'd say about CCS is, you're right, it's very expensive. These credits may help to some degree, but probably not enough to make them competitive without direct regulation or a carbon tax. One of the other things that they're talking about is using CCS for enhanced oil recovery. So, utilizing it to bring up residual oil that couldn't otherwise be recovered. Of course, that means you're utilizing more fossil fuels, and then have to capture the emissions associated with it. So that may not be terribly popular with a lot of people. And you've got some large public resistance to CCS too. As a law person, I have to say I think this is under discussed. There's been CCS pilot projects in places that give a damn a lot more about climate change than we do, like the Netherlands and Germany, where local communities have resisted successfully those projects because they fear that the CCS is going to be released, whether that's rational or not, and those projects have been killed, right? I think in this country that means some of those projects may be killed, or at the very least will again enhance the cost of them because of the associated litigation, and also delay their deployment. So it's far from clear that CCS has a lot of future.
That's a problem for the biofuel CCS as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And direct air capture.
When you dump it, stays there.
Yeah. Well,
The staying there is not very uncertain.
yeah, but the perceptions may be, and that's the problem. Is that, I agree with her. I think we have sufficient areas to store all of our carbon, and we can do it permanently. The public perceptions may be different, right? And so instead of NIMBY, right, not in my backyard, they're starting to talk about NUMBY, not under my backyard. And that kind of resistance, whether it is scientifically supportable or not, can make a huge difference in terms of how quickly this is driven and how costly it might be.
More questions? Sorry, did you want to ask about?
Oh, well, sure. We've been talking a lot about biomass, and as we know, there's a lot of existing biomass that's goes to waste, whether it's in the landfills or farmlands. And I was wondering, have you guys discussed particularly using the existing biomass that's going to waste in these plants instead of growing them, like using a lot of land, existing land that could possibly be repurposed for other uses. So yeah, I'm just curious about that.
So the numbers I mentioned incredibly briefly for the overlap analysis at the US scale, where it's basically saying how much biomass could you use for bioenergy in regions that overlie storage basins. Those numbers we were pulling from the billion-ton study from the US Department of Energy, and we used the 2020 numbers from their estimates that are basically something like 40%, maybe 45% woody biomass, and woody biomass residues, 40% agricultural residues, and those are both a little bit greater than about 10% dedicated bioenergy crops in the 2020 timeframe. They kind of envision a scenario where the bioenergy crops could go up through time, but the residues are in there as part of it. I think the key thing is you can't kind of pull all of the residues from agriculture out, otherwise you lose the fact that you need to kind of leave some of them there for the health of the soil. And then another hard part is that a lot of these residues are bulky and difficult to transport. So they lose the fact that things like gasoline are great because they are so energy dense, and going to other types of fuels is harder just because they're so much bulkier.
Yes, in the back.
Could you, since algae is so productive, could you generate a lot of algae and then put it down a hole and stuck it in the earth that way?
Sure, in terms of sequestering carbon, yeah, you could do that. You could also do it with land plants, and people have talked about, for example, taking crop residue and burying it actually in the ocean. You would transfer it to areas in the deep ocean where it ultimately get buried and sequestered from the atmosphere. So certainly you can, any biomass that you generate, if you really want to sequester it, one way to do it is to bury it and to just really take it out of the carbon cycle. So that's possible in terms of the economics, desirability, et cetera. That might be another issue, but sure. And that's basically what the ocean does. A tiny fraction of the phytoplankton production that occurs in the ocean ultimately gets buried. And the whole system is called a carbon pump, and that's the end result is actually a very teeny fraction of the photosynthesis ever actually gets out of the ocean system. And certainly one thing we can think about is maybe engineering that to make it more efficient, make it so that more burial occurs, either artificially or naturally.
Let's do one more question. Somebody, I'll see if there's another person. Yeah.
Could you please expand a little bit more on the relative cost of some of these measures? You mentioned earlier that there was more financing needed to better study which options were feasible, but in terms of actually implementing these measures, how much do they cost relative to each other, and what sort of financing mechanisms might be available to pay for them?
I think Will has more comprehensive data, so I'll give a few data points first and then flip over. Just the examples I gave through the course of the presentation, so the forest offset program that's part of California's cap and trade market, those credits, basically a 100-year guarantee for carbon stored on the land are right now $10 a ton, so it's actually even a little bit cheaper than the cost of tradable credits for emissions allowances within the cap and trade program overall. For those bioethanol with CCS numbers, which would be the cheapest in the space of BECS and actually also in bioenergy, just straight carbon capture and storage. What we calculated through a very detailed techno-economic assessment, combining kind of process engineering, full life cycle analysis, would be that for a $50 sequestration credit, which is basically you're just counting the CO2 going underground, the sequestration credit in the Budget Act that was just passed doesn't look at the full life cycle. That for $50 a ton, you could get almost all of the bioethanol CCS capturing, so it's about 30 million tons per year at a cost of $50 per ton of CO2. I think I got those numbers all right. And if you wanted to go up to something like $90 a ton for an abatement credit, which is how to think about the analog in California's low carbon fuel standard, you could technically get almost all of it, but there's not enough demand in California alone to pick that up, but you have other low carbon fuel standards picking up. And then the direct air capture, the most optimistic number that's being thrown around is the exact one that Will described for Climeworks, which is $400 to $500 a ton.
It's cheap. I mean, relatively compared to the direct air.
Right. I think another issue here is capacity. There are methods that are economic now to consume and use or store CO2. The issue is they're just not really big enough to make a big enough impact. What we really need is a cost supply curve that describes what the capacity and cost is, and actually how much we could consume and store for a given price. The problem is that there's so little information about the economics, at least of a lot of stuff I talked about, that it's quite imprecise. And that's another reason we need more research, to get a better feel for how really efficient are these and how much can we do, and these sorts of questions really demand more research to really come up with the economics that would really allow us to make some intelligent decisions as to which one of these to use.
So I'm going to take the last question as a governance question, to maybe as a sort of scenario of how you might imagine the CDRs coming into the Paris Agreement. So is the vision sort of, I mean, it took a long time to understand the carbon budget and there was some attempt early on, not very successful, to apportion responsibility with targets. That didn't work so well, so now, but hopefully there's this idea through the pledge process that we understand if people need to up their pledges or not. So some notion of allocation of responsibility. Would you see that with CDRs as well?
Yeah.
Is that the sort of, we need this amount of carbon dioxide removal and everybody's got to chip in, or is it going to be in your NDCs? how would you imagine apportioning global responsibility for carbon dioxide removal as a supplementary part of mitigation?
Yeah, there's been some rudimentary discussion of that, right? The Paris Agreement drops the reference in the Framework Convention to common but differentiated responsibilities, right? Which emphasizes that developed countries are supposed to take the lead because of their historic emissions and their technological and economic capabilities. But Paris still talks about in Article 4 that developed countries are supposed to take absolute reductions in emissions, and developing countries are supposed to aim to get to that point, right? So there's still some ipso facto sense of more responsibility by developed countries. And so in theory, that could be applied in the context of carbon dioxide removal approaches also, that given the superior technological abilities and the historic responsibilities, presumably developed countries would have to expend more in terms of resources and take the lead in developing those and allocating it within their budget. But it's far from clear. I mean, most of these things, again, are a twinkle in the eye of even researchers, much less diffusing into the parties themselves and getting them to start to discuss it and how they might allocate those responsibilities. But if we ultimately go down this path, we will have to do that. And we'll presumably start developing protocols, and as we have with things like RED, right, reduced emissions from deforestation, and presumably create some kind of formulas, but long time coming.
Yeah, understandable. All right, well, I hope you'll join me in thanking our three panelists for